feel like I'm on the news.
Okay, we're live. So welcome to NOOPOLITIK with Daniel Fraga and Owen Cox. So I just want to let all of you know that with this series, we're trying to introduce a new concept, which is basically trying to capture the politics of the noosphere or the politics of the 21st century. In some sense, what we're trying to do is articulate a politics that is beyond kind of the 20th century model of politics, because in the 20th century, it was structured by two mega powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and their various economic methods. Of course, it was a battle ultimately between capitalism in the United States and communism in the Soviet Union, and they had their proxy wars in what was called the Third World, and of course, that whole 20th century struggle is now over, and there's already the establishment of a global hegemony of capitalism, which really has no real opposite or real challenge. And in some sense, this hegemony of neoliberalism is in some sense reaching its own logical contradictions, I think, now in 2020 with the coronavirus outbreak, the pandemic, that we need to think politics of the global that is capable of dealing with mass global catastrophes that affect all of us. And at the same time, the real of the international space is really structured by these very strange, what I would call mega informational creatures like Facebook and YouTube and Google and Amazon, and the list goes on, where these entities really control the political landscape. And they're very difficult to categorize. They're not really operating democratically. They're not really just, they're definitely not, public, but they're kind of not private bodies either, because they're really the whole world population is really their object. So I think in some paradoxical way, the entire human population is something like the third world now, and the battleground upon which these mega informational creatures like Facebook, YouTube, Google, Amazon are, competing over our attention as the battleground. So it's kind of like the mental warfare is our attention, and the mental warfare is where the entire world is now working out the politics of what we're calling politics of the noosphere or NOOPOLITIK. So how can we think this emergent global order, or how have both of you in your various activities started to conceptualize this emergent global order, and how to act as a consequence of it? So I'll pass that on to both of you.
Yeah, Owen, would you like to start? Shall I?
Go for it, dude.
So, paraphrasing Pat Ryan, who's got some interesting thinking done around this. In AI warfare, civilization is the battleground, civilization is the weapon of war, and civilization is the spoils of war simultaneously. The technological conditions that allowed these tech giants to achieve such a outsized advantage and to be able to exert that technological power on populations, I think that's key. It's important to realize that the war machine and the competition for supremacy is kind of this vector that pushes the development of technology and civilization forward in many ways, right? The internet was first invented by the American military-industrial complex. It was the ARPANET, if I'm not mistaken. And so the whole point is that it has matured to the point where perhaps its initial purpose has been fulfilled, which is we currently live in this decentralized hive mind where wise and cunning and well-structured and strategically deployed informational campaigns have the power to influence deeply the geopolitical outcomes of basically whatever you want. It's a tremendous weapon. It's just that it is neurological, not necessarily physical. Dugin, who we've spoken to recently, has the concept of noomahia, which is sort of a parallel to the noopolitics concept, which is basically politics and war in the noosphere. Someone once said that politics is war is the continuation of politics by other means. They exist kind of in a spectrum, and that's kind of the metaphor that we're using here. And yes, in the age of fourth generation warfare, psychological warfare, irregular warfare campaigns, war gets to a point where it becomes ontological, where the battlefield is human attention, human belief, the ability for humans to formulate ideas and to sense make. And that is also the objective of techno-capitalism. So you could even say that in the noosphere, in noopolitics, you don't only have states playing this game, quote unquote game, but you also have corporations, you have businesses, you have all different sorts of players. No longer the nation state of the post-Westphalian order are engaging in war today, but a variety of other types of players. And so just to finish off and to quote Zizek, or to paraphrase a little bit of what he says, in this warfare, and by warfare I mean it's simultaneously warfare and techno-capitalism, because today they are pretty much indistinguishable, and that's also notable to refer. In this warfare, the very means to articulate our own oppression are wrested away from us. They're taken away from us. They are colonized. The grammar is colonized. You know, Deleuze says that grammar is a political. To speak in the political, the unity of grammar is political. That's what Deleuze says. And so you could even say that it strikes at our attention, at our ability to formulate alternatives, to even fight in this war. So in this sense, we are not always already, maybe already today, militarized subjects, and we do not know it. We are active participants in that war, and we do not know it. So I'd leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I'll kind of pick up from where you leave off. I think you've done a good job of sketching perhaps the terrain and the macro entities. I think an equally interesting and important subject is, if we're talking about politics and indeed neuropolitics, what is the political subject at this stage in history? I think one of the things we're beginning to grasp is that we're talking about a very different type of human being who is subject to the flows and the rules of power. There's this great passage in Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media where he talks about an American soldier who finds himself in Italy after the Second World War. And he says he's looking around and everything, all the walls are covered in political slogans. And the soldier says, or writes down in his diary, something along the lines of, the Italians will never be able to civilize and create a society until they get rid of all these political slogans and replace them with consumer advertisements. And what he expresses there, I think, is basically the spirit on which the 20th century, the American 20th century, and the global capitalist world order that expanded out of it, the essence of how it relates to its political subjects. It channels their energies into these consumer desires in a way that actually makes them quite peaceful and docile in general. And this isn't to say that there haven't been political battles. There weren't rivals between, say, trade unions and then the triumph of neoliberalism around about the 70s and 80s. But nonetheless, most libido, if you will, the energy that can lead into escalating chaos, rivalries, violence, was constrained by the the games of chasing after pretty things and identifying with pretty images on screens, as opposed to identifying heavily with signifiers of identity that carried significant meaning and weight for how you actually relate and how you have to live with other people in anything but a very trivial way. So you can have lifestyle consumerism and lifestyle marketing, but as long as it doesn't become excessively political, what's happened in the last 20 to 30 years, I think, is that lifestyle and politics have merged to such an extent that now there's this new kind of constellation of identity around signifiers. It's basically the culture war dynamics. It's people experiencing race or gender or sexuality to such an extreme extent that they are the peace that was established via this Pax Americana, this Pax Consumptarian, well, Pax, not Consumptarian, that's a different word, but Pax consumerism, if you will, dissipated. And we find a struggle and a battle for meaning and the construction of identity, as I'm saying, and identity becoming more and more politicized and important. And kind of as Fraga was getting across as well, the ways that identity is constituted are no longer around the real and the material. Typically, politics for the last 200 years has been fought between economic classes, the bourgeoisie, the managers, the owners of factories, the machinery, and the proletariat, the working classes, the guys who have to earn their money by wages. And the real of their living conditions structured their battles: left-wing politics, right-wing politics, labor parties, conservative parties, which are really neoliberal parties in today. But now all these signifiers fly from the airwaves at people, and they are not just a distraction from the real, but actually there's something in which the virtual reality is now more real than the real itself. It doesn't matter so much that you are that you're a worker in a factory or in a care home or anywhere else. It matters who you follow on Instagram, who you follow on YouTube, what Twitter guys you follow. Complete fragmentation of these like big collectivities. And so it's increasingly difficult for things like the labor movement, for the left-wing movement, to form any kind of consensus and whole, because it's so disparate. And I expect that with the increase in information flows, this is only going to get more chaotic, more random. And perhaps I'm going on a bit now, but I think this is, as Daniel goes to Pat Ryan drives this very well, in that when it talks about autocults, this phenomenon that now we've got machines generating data on pretty much everything we do. They can kind of A/B test human behavior and human identity by slinging a bunch of advertising signifiers, a bunch of things to construct identity around, like could be meaningless adverts, but then tracking the imprints on behavior that they cause. And then you might end up with, what happens if we show a bunch of American Texan soccer mums adverts about horses? I don't know, maybe nothing. Maybe it makes them want to go and have an affair. Maybe it makes them want to go and eat chocolate. Fuck knows, it could be anything, but we can collect the data and know, or I say we, entities can collect the data and know. So where advertising a la a 20th century model would be sling people advertisements and get them to go after products, increasingly technologies, artificial intelligence will be able to throw content media at people and just see any sort of wild outcomes coming out the box. And it doesn't actually matter why the outcome is happening. This is the point that Pat Ryan drives. There's a kind of black box of epistemology. As long as you can see a correlation between show people one thing, outcome over here, there's space to play with. And this brings us to the territory of noopolitics, right? Influential entities, influential players will be intrigued by the influences, by the behavioral conditioning that can be had just by showing pieces of content, by showing neurological imprints, if you will. Culture, the mind, is all of a sudden, it's always been the battle space, the medium for shaping people and pushing them in ways. But I think with the fracturing of identity and the opening up of the technological possibilities, this is only going to be ever more complex and chaotic.
Yeah, I think just building on that, like, I think that in some sense, you know, our minds have always been the battleground in some sense, because, like, think about if we were the same age as we are now in 1914, we would all be basically harvested by a state and sent into World War I to die. So it was, you know, using a certain belief structure, using a certain sort of, using a certain form of ideology to get us to give our lives away to something bigger than us, give our lives away to something, an idea basically, the idea of the West or the idea of the state. I think that now the difference is that what we're giving our minds to are different entities. They're different agents. It's no longer the United States of America, or it's no longer a nation state, but it's this much more invisible, abstract entity of, YouTube algorithms, Facebook algorithms. I mean, that's what we're using this very moment, in some sense, to get out our message, and that's very positive. But at the same time, these algorithms are dominating attention in such a way, in basically an invisible way. Like it's kind of like what Fraga was saying about the Zizek quote, that the very frame within which we are political entities is invisible. The very frame within which we participate is invisible. And I think that means that's a call on us to become more aware as subjects. So like I can say, for example, for myself, I almost want to use this medium and I want to use this podcast to try to reconstitute myself as a political subject, because when, for example, Trump was elected, I kind of just disappeared from the political sphere. I just kind of withdrew from the political sphere. And I think that was kind of that unconscious activity on my part was the recognition that the frame within which the political game was being played was itself absurd to such a level that I need to withdraw from it. And I need to rethink. And I think I did the same thing with cell phones. Like for the last 6 years, I don't use a cell phone. And I think that this withdrawal was an unconscious way for me was almost an unconscious identification of this invisible frame within which we are being puppeteered in this very, I think, disturbing and for me paralyzing way, because I don't know how to act as a political subject. It's almost like the machine is so enormous, it's so omnipresent, it's so it's omnipresent and omni powerful, that it freezes my identity. I don't know. To me, I don't know how to constitute myself as a political subject, because the nation state doesn't really have the same meaning that it used to anymore. Left and right don't have the same meaning as they do anymore. And I think that's also the importance of talking about new politic, that what I see in the ideological wars are people on the left and right using signifiers that only made sense in the 20th century. So like people will use signifiers related to communism, or people will use signifiers related to fascism. But these are kind of like empty signifiers of 20th century politics. Like they made sense in the context of 20th century politics, but it seems to me like the whole field we're engaging in is different. And like, before I pass it on again, I guess what's emerging spontaneously in the reconstitution of myself as a political subject is the attention of my subjectivity towards essentially communal aims. So like, if I use my attention, if I use my limited time and energy towards activities which are in essence communal, or I don't know what other word to use other than that, then I would say that in and of itself is the revolutionary act. That the more we can decondition our attention from algorithmic determination, and the more we can direct our attention towards self-posited communal networking activity, the more we can sort of start the process of using these algorithms towards our own benefit. But even then, I want to become skeptical of myself, like, how deeply are we being conditioned right now? Like we have almost no choice but to exist within mediums of expression which are simultaneously and paradoxically both liberating, being able to speak to the whole world like we are now, and kind of dictatorship mediums where your content can be pulled at any moment, where you can be erased at any moment, where you can be shown content which is strategically manipulating you and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I want to talk about two things. I want to make some notes about the status quo, and then I want to talk a little bit about the political subject and ways to act and how to answer the question that we're formulating. So resistance is recuperated. Capitalism is inescapably recuperating everything. It is the Che Guevara t-shirt paradigm that ruled perhaps the latter part of the 20th century, with so many of the theorists that we base our work on. Recuperation is a process whereby anything that was once real or expressing a desire for change, resistance to the paradigm, an insurrection, an exercise of freedom. Recuperation is a process whereby that is castrated, made marketable, made commodity, and then reintegrated within the spectacle, having had its recuperation, its revolutionary potential castrated. The word revolutionary here is interesting because that's what I'll get to in the second part, in a counterintuitive way, obviously. So yes, warfare is ontological right now. It is striking at the core of how we even exist, how we signify things. If the dichotomy between status quo and resistance has been subsumed, if there's no difference between these two, then what happens is that we are unable to formulate that difference within us. Those two concepts have been collapsed into a one-dimensional plane, into the same plane, and therefore we've been defeated. Period. That's my view. I was cutting my hair today. I went to the hair. I don't know if you can notice, but
Beautiful.
VH1 was playing there. VH1, the music channel. And I was looking at that and I'm like, yes, this is war. This is war being waged on me right now. Perhaps it looks like capitalism. Perhaps someone would say, oh, but that's just the free market and that's just the evolution of culture and liberalism. And for example, there was this Moulin Rouge video clip, which is essentially prostitution being marketed to prepubescent women. And quite literally and quite deliberately, by the way, I would say this and defend this. It's pretty self-evident to me. Not making a value judgment here, but saying that what they were doing was ontological warfare insofar as they were actually laying down ontological cues of how to signify, how to exist in the world. The gestures, the facial expressions, the dances fulfill the same role that an advertising fulfills. Reminds you that you're supposed to act in such and such a way. Within capitalism, whenever you see an advertising, it's not only the message, here's a very cheap pen that you can buy, but also the medium is very important, which is advertising, reminding you that you are a consumer, that you are a buyer, that your ontology is formulated in sense of consuming. And if you are of the revolutionary temperament, we got some pretty cool t-shirts for you as well. So this is theological warfare. You are how you consume. In the current stage of capitalism, we're no longer having the same struggles as union people who were fighting for union rights in factories had in the 19th and 20th century. Today, our struggle is more around creative consumerism, right? You are how you consume. I love to buy eco-conscious brands and I like to whatever. That is still a continuation of the same process. It's the paradigm that I mentioned to you the other day, Cadell, of a boss that is no longer a tyrant, but is really nice to you. And therefore you continue to lack the language to articulate your own and freedom. And that's why I suspect of Trump's character as such an evidently and so on the nose caricature of a tyrant. It was like, that's so easy to hate, isn't it? So easy to hate. Deceptively so. But I'll leave that one at that. So the panopticon today is complete. Social engineering knows how to use this. The panopticon, Owen, like you were talking about, the proliferation of the data that can be harnessed. And we're always already in consumer performance mode, right? That's what we're reminded that we are. So let me go to the second part of what I wanted to say, and I'll try not to expand myself too much. Whereas previously, we know this, the kings and the priests were the makers of culture. Today, their throne is up for grabs. And there's a king of the hill game for that throne. And that throne is people want it. They want it bad. And the people who want it and who are striving to have it are no longer governments, businesses, corporations, foreign powers, agencies within the same nation, agencies outside of the Western nations, mimetic dudes on YouTube, Instagram influencers. Everyone is playing at the same game, which is influencing other people's minds, beliefs, ways to be. So it's kind of I don't know how to pronounce it properly in Latin, but it's the bellum omnibus omnibus. So the war of all against all. And there's no factions. Everyone can jump between factions whenever they want. Left and right doesn't apply in the noosphere. That applies in regular war and regular politics. In the noosphere, there's only domination and dominated. And as such, to answer what is the political subject? Today, the political subject cannot be an identity because identity equals commodity. The political subject can only be process. Process of what? Of, well, certain digital libido, right? This is the politics now played at the level of rebel signification. The way that you signify that you value, that you create your own values, and that tomorrow you will do the same again in a different way. I think that's the level at which political subjectivity, I would like to play it. And that's why I speak of ontological design. Because what does it mean? It means the creation of your own functions, of your own desires. Very Deleuzian. It's a way to sort of not go back to perhaps community and become a hermit, but to go through. The only ways through in accelerationism and the way that I see it, right? And the way through is animism. Is why animism? Because that's the first religion. That's the first way to sense make in the world. It's like, oh shit, wind is alive now. So that's the same thing that I believe we can do, because that's the root at which we can signify in a rebellious way. And it's also sort of a ever increasing faster loop of this. And that's my take on the political subject.
I think this question of influence, what influences, who influences, and how do we influence is super key. Before I touch on that, though, there's just like something that Cadell said that I'd like to expand on slightly, which is talking about, Cadell, you said when the whole Trump thing happened and then you withdrew. I think there's a very interesting litmus test for where people are at today, which is basically in how they reacted to the election of Biden in 2020. Because a lot of people I've spoken to, they've told me, like, I got this massive sense of relief when Biden was elected. It's like things are finally back to normal. I think if that is the frame that people are bringing to the table, I would suggest you're not really paying attention. Trump is a symptom of something much deeper. In some sense, he is both riding the wave of the national populist movement as set up by kind of theorized by Steve Bannon, but also understanding digital. He's the first social media president. He gets Twitter. I think probably what we're going to see is 4 years under Biden and then something chaotic again, something fucking, perhaps not another Trump, but it's going to get fucking weird. And what coronavirus is going to throw away, we don't know. But so that sense that the election of Biden has brought us back to normal bourgeois 20th century Pax Americana values should be flushed away. But to go back to influence, because as Daniel was getting at, influence is coming at us from all directions now, and it's very difficult to understand, let alone trust, what the influences are. And of course, that's true in the 20th century as well. And before that, it's the problem with doing mass society and having representation and influence at a distance. When you've got tribes, villages, even communities where it's possible to at least have some kind of relationship with the speakers, with the town criers, with the local politicians, with the public figures, with the priests, with the people whose voices, whose words, whose access to the symbols shape the landscape. We no longer have that. It's just like an abstract voting thing. And then someone who you've seen on a screen or heard on a radio or read a tweet from makes decisions that affect life, or Hollywood or the music industry, right? But it brings us to what we appear to be doing in our circles at the moment, which is building our own influence network. We are, in some very real sense, becoming influencers upon each other. There's an element in which we are consuming each other's content and engaging in each other's content creation, making podcasts, making YouTube videos, and then having private forums, having chats, having meeting face to face when we can, exploring ideas. There's an actual teleology to the ideas. There's a kind of creative collective, but I think it's not situated purely in the level of abstract theorizing as perhaps creative intellectual endeavors would be, say, in an academy. I think this is very apparent in something like the European men's movement, where there's a theoretical component and an influential component, but there's also genuine thinking about how a movement can be grown and scaled to interact with men en masse. And I see the European men's movement as a political movement, a non-parliamentary, non-party-based political movement, but nonetheless a mass of collective, actively engaged citizens seeking some kind of responsibility and stake in the world at hand, looking to bring others on board and having this really powerful shared signifier, which I think is the signifier of man, which, Cadell, you've spoken before, I think, about how the 21st century, we return in a very primal sense to the real of the human, to sex, if you will, to gender, nation, religion. They're all higher order abstractions, race even. Like, there's obviously race as in skin color, but then the identity that gets built upon it and used to construct senses of racism or racial superiority are very symbolic, where sex and gender, like I said, takes us much more down to the level of the real. And maybe I'll sling that out to you guys there. But yeah, so the two things I'm thinking of are these influence bubbles, and also the collective identity moving from something like nation down to something like the body.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously people who see Biden as a victory are not understanding the deeper symptom at the core of Trump. And for me, it's not Trump himself which is the problem, but the conditions of possibility for Trump. It's the conditions of possibility is the symptom of the society itself, which allows the center of our political activity to become an absurd reality TV show. And I think that it calls upon us now. And I think that the way I interpret, my own withdrawal as a political subject, and also my recognition of a desire to come back as a political subject, is to seek the real of politics and even the meaning of politics. There's a quote I like from a physicist, Sean Carroll, who said, "We know a lot about physics, we know a little bit about chemistry, we know a little about biology, and we know nothing about politics." There's this way in which our own unconscious of our own activity, our own unconscious of ourself, is going to need to be made more conscious. That doesn't mean that we need to be made more conscious to the point where we eradicate unconsciousness, but we become conscious of the unconscious, which is the unknown dimension of our political activity, our political organizing possibility. And I think that the only way to get at that real is to start with things that I can actually see, feel, hear, and touch. So, like, for example, like Owen was saying, we are becoming influencers in our various networks, but we are feeding into each other and we are influencing each other. And we have to keep connecting that feeding into each other on the level of actual bodily links that we actually have a structural necessity as bodies to interact and to be with each other and to commune with each other. Otherwise, we lose a real that goes into the level of the image, where I think most influencers, quote unquote, are, which is that most influencers are not actually in the real with the people they're influencing. They're just trying to scale up their influencing activity to the level where they have billions of views, and they're ultimately disconnected from everyone. They're pseudo kings and pseudo queens, like female Instagram influencers on whatever platform that they're on. They're pseudo queens. And like same like the what I'm trying to say is that what is the influence about? Is it feeding into any real emancipatory political activity? And I think that, I guess, where I sort of get some sense of redefining politics away from the signifiers of 20th century politics is to think, for example, the actual struggle of sexual difference, or the actual struggle of the body itself. Like, what do we actually want? If we're getting in touch with our actual bodily energy, and we want to decouple from the algorithms which are basically using our bodily energy and sucking it up into the matrix, into the internet, then what would we be doing with our bodily energy if we weren't sucked, if it wasn't sucked into this basically dictatorship of the algorithm? What would we be doing with our body? How would we be as political subjects if we weren't in this sort of situation? And I think that, okay, I'll give my first answer to this in relationship to Fraga's definition of the political subject. So he said the political subject that becomes an identity becomes immediately a commodity. So, for example, Black Lives Matter, and then you have the biggest bank in the US put up Black Lives Matter slogans. You'll have all the biggest retailers selling you Black Lives Matter clothes. The same thing happened with feminism. You have commodification of feminism. You have commodification of identity politics, where as soon as you get a coherent signifier as your identity, you become a commodity. But if we are identity as process, then we have to take our entire, I think logically, we have to take our identity as a totality, which is basically from birth to the grave. Basically, we have to define our identity in relationship not to the algorithms, but to death itself. And if we take our identity not in relationship to the algorithms, but to death itself, then we can co-create something which actually transcends us, which actually transcends our own process. So I'll pass that to you, Fraga.
Yeah, then you are perhaps able to create symbolic currencies that can be exchanged between communities that are not without value, that are not worthless, that are not dead at birth. Because these symbolic currencies, they are not mined from the spectacle, from capitalism, at this point, that is a non-possibility, because the bottleneck is already upon us. There are two types there's one type of person, and there's perhaps within that one great group of people, perhaps a small group. We are now already defeated, and it's as chaotic as it gets, right? Because like we've been saying, it's not identity that we should strive towards, but rather process. And by which process? Signification, value creation, valuation, Nietzschean value creation. So historically and naturally, even, it is not for people are social beings. Signification is something best left to the collective and to the priests and kings who have historically taken care of that task. Now, we might as well understand that we are in an epistemological Armageddon. The noological atomic bomb has been dropped, and we're living in its debris. It's the blast wave is reaching us slowly, but there will be points where it's going to reach us totally. And what does it mean for it to reach us? It means to just fucking go with the flow and think whatever the next advertising tells you to think, or even if it's a rebellious one. But I want to focus on something. The political subject, as I see it, understands this acceleration. And I think the only way that we can deal with this, and thought experiment, I want to throw this onto you, is to revert back again to animism, to the basics. So imagine you are high on fucking 5 or 10 grams of mushrooms, and it's raining, and you're naked in the steppe, and you have no fire, you have no stones, it's thunderstorm happening, something like that, right? I don't know, when you're in psychedelics, it's like you do not know how to signify, and you really have to like face an internal, grab inwards, grab belief, because then, yes, this is perhaps a practice of meditating with death, like you mentioned, Cadell. And what does this thought experience point towards, in my view? It points towards the fact that power lies in the ability to attribute value and signification to things in your own terms, which is basically the original creative mad act. And what the digital flood is going to produce as kind of this increase in pressure against rebellious signification is these diamonds, is the ability for people to actually from themselves extract something. Final example, the classic example, Diogenes. For Diogenes to have had the balls that he had to tell the god king Alexander, who was offering him, hey, I'll give you anything you want, Diogenes, and for him to be able to tell him, move away from the sun. Think about that, right? This is the god emperor of half the known world. I'll give you anything, right? This is the devil tempting Jesus, by the way, in the biblical story. And for him to be able to say, fuck off from the sun, means something deeper than just being a weirdo hermit who is able to stand away from society. No, he would live in society, he would fuck around with it. But I think it points towards this signification that comes from a master morality. I know what is good for me, and that is the dichotomy that is at play in the noosphere. It's no longer left-right, but rather dominator and dominated. So that's the humble answer that I would give to this question. The answer is process.
Yeah, I mean, I build on that. It's like we're in a very Deleuzean territory, essentially. Individuality, fluxes, flows passing through us. There's something you said, Daniel, that I feel like perhaps noting and correcting slightly. So you said like power comes from signifying reality on your own terms. That is also sounds to me like a complete definition of schizophrenia, psychosis. There's something about being able to signify reality on your own terms in a way that still enables you to enter into subjective meaning making and relationship with others. Otherwise, you're not a political subject. You're just the madman on the edge of the village, which is fine if you want to be on the madman on the edge of the village. But if you want to fuck and be invited to the parties, then you need to have some kind of belonging.
I think it's precisely that madness that enables you to engage with true sociability. Otherwise, you're just exchanging.
Well, of course, and this brings us to that distinction between the tantric and the sutric, right? There is the tantric is being in that mad mode, but then the recognition that there is tantric space and sutric space is the recognition that you can't be in the tantric space all the time, and you almost shouldn't take anything that happens in the tantric space too seriously. Maybe you see visions of God. Maybe you drop 10 grams of mushrooms and become one with whatever deity it is you worship, but you still have to wake up the next morning and go to work. And if you're going to be that guy telling everyone he's seen God and he's seen the light, they're going to tell you to fuck off. And because the ego recuperates whatever transcendent experience comes out from underneath it. And maybe in a way that's precisely what the logic of capital does as well. If capital is understood as a bit of a like commodifying ego, it finds a way to transform into repeatable images any kind of like pathic flux. That's a aside that just kind of sprung out of my mind. But what I come back to is this idea of like, it's a Deleuzian space, but a big question is, why did the first disciples of Deleuze in, say, like the 90s and the 2000s, they've not produced anything that radical or that interesting, I don't think. Like where, and perhaps Cadell or Fraga, you might have a better understanding of this than me. It's like, what are Deleuzians not getting?
I think Deleuzians are not getting the paradox of becoming and the paradox of multiplicity. You can't have just a pure becoming without death. And you can't have multiplicity without the recognition that we want to be one. In other words, becoming is filtered through death, and multiplicity is filtered through the absence of the one. Multiplicity is filtered through lack. And Deleuze, in my view, misses. And for anyone who wants to check this out on my episode, the conversation I had with Todd McGowan on Emancipation After Hegel, I feel like Deleuze does not understand the way becoming is processed through death and the way in which multiplicity is processed through lack or the desire to be one. And when you inscribe both of these metaphysical notions, I think there's the possibility to get out, to escape, as Frege always is looking in his politics for an escape from this dominator-dominated political sphere. Because the crucial thing is that for the Hegelian subject, you recognize that your dominator, the master, is this invisible frame of algorithmic intelligence, which is playing with your attention, playing with your drives, playing with your libidinal energy, almost playing with you like a ventriloquist doll. That you decouple from these strings of being regulated by this because it's ultimately a fake master, and that this fake master gets its power from you, the slave. It in itself is impotent. It only gets its power because you gave the power to it. And then through mediation on your own full process, what do I want to do with my life given the power and the intensity of death? What would I do if a gun was pressed to my head this moment? How would I act if you have to cultivate an awareness of the fact that you're alive through the consciousness that you're going to die. And then you gain the power to assert you escape the dominator-dominated matrix of your current moment. And you can do something potentially different. You can do something potentially new because you're no longer being influenced like a puppet through influencers who don't care about you. And on the positive end of the medium we're in, where we do now have access to build our own platforms which can reach anyone in the world, you can potentially build a political body that does not have sort of regulation by the state or capital, but is an actual communitas. But that, the steps towards real community, are, to me, is where we need to make sure that our reason is constantly engaged with the present moment of contradiction of our own identities. So we have to be aware of the way in which our identities are contradictory. For example, I have to be fully aware that I am using the mediums upon which I'm critiquing. And I have to be fully aware that the possibility of community requires that I use this energy, which I may be directing in a communal way, but it has to, in some sense, transcend the mediums upon which I'm at the same time a slave. So that's to me where I'm trying to think at the moment. Fraga, why don't the both of you give sort of your view on what we've so far approached with this idea of new politic and where we could possibly take it going forward?
So, two things that I took note. There's no escaping master-dominator dynamics. That's kind of the yin-yang. That's kind of the material conditions of the world. That's part of being incarnate. There's no escaping death either. So these are, there's no escaping having to eat often and drink water. So I think it's part of that. That which we state that we believe sometimes is slightly overrated when it's compared to the praxis. And praxis can be, authentic, or it can be sort of inauthentic, to go Heideggerian on this. And what I mean by this is that when I speak about escaping and signifying out of your own authentic self, when I speak of evaluating the world in your own terms, I'm not saying that this is going to produce something substantially new that's going to change the world for everyone. Much to the contrary. What it does, or what it might do, is provide us with the means to get a recovery of the small sacred things. And our life is therefore filled with meaning. I dropped this glass 3 times today, coffee. I spilled coffee 3 times today. What does that mean? Just the ability to ask this question. What does this mean to me? That is, I think, a sort of very interesting animism, creative approach to synchronicity. It's the paranoid critical method that Ram Koolhaas applies in urbanism, where you take just weird things that really don't fit together and you speak one in terms of the other, create a metaphor, and you invent something else. That something else is still within the yin-yang matrix, but at least you're creating them yourself, and there's an authentic first-degree relationship that you have with them, or in that precise moment. So that's what I mean by create. It's the humblest thing you can imagine. It's I spilled the coffee 3 times today. What does that mean? But I think it's in the praxis of doing that is truly revolutionary in the noopolitics, because the noopolitics, remember, is always about colonizing this. So if I make my meaning myself, and if I'm not too brash and go too fully schizophrenic on it, which is a possibility, then I'm being refined and crafting myself with a certain care, and that might be the most revolutionary ability there is. And so from those small bits that you create, might you then eventually create community? Because community is that. Community is me asking you, what do you think that means? Like spilling the coffee 3 times. You knowing me and me knowing you, for example. Because those are the real bonds. It's not really what do you think about perhaps some other shared meme in the noopolitical sphere, even though it is also included there. So that would be kind of my final answer. The recovery of the small sacred through animism.
So we've been talking about the new landscape and the new subject and community influence the reel of bodies in some sense. What was very present for me, what feels like the next step, and I think you guys have heard me saying this before, is the question of actually claiming a bit more agency within this landscape. Like, I think influence and attention is probably the prime currency, but there's also we also still live in the overlap between a new paradigm and an old bourgeois capitalist paradigm. And I certainly feel the pinch of having one foot in that world and one foot in this online creative podcasting intellectual world. It's almost like I live two lives at the moment, which is bizarre. And perhaps it's also helpful to have one foot in both of those lives. But also in terms of constituting myself as the next kind of type of political subject, it strikes me that things like Cadell has mentioned, like obviously you unplugged from having a phone, you ceased following politics so intensely after the election of Trump. I think it's little things like that of as long as we're still using the symbols and the significations, as we've discussed, of the 20th century, part of our identity, part of our political identity, part of our agency, and part of our libido will be framed within the conditions of possibility of the 20th century. We will at the very least construct our superegos based on what it is that our parents and that our grandparents expect us to do. Like, are you going to get a degree? Are you going to settle down in a house somewhere? Are you going to get married and have kids? And having that superego that's in an old paradigm while trying to struggle to a new paradigm, while producing a kind of tension that is creative, it's also existentially anguishing. And so where I'm interested is in actually how a different superego can be constructed. And I don't think it's going to get to a stage where old superego is gone completely. Maybe that's what the next generation might have. But that feels important so that identity can be constructed differently, and then we can begin to approach the problems thrown up by our new technological and informational climate, by our new forms of desiring, forms of sexuality, forms of rivalry, of jealousy, of conflict, of seeking status. So there's also probably an element of also creating spaces to explore these new emerging difficulties of the subject condition, which again, Cadell, I think is what we kind of move towards somewhat in our men's circles, although they're often again working with guys who are very much in the 20th century petty bourgeois mode. I wonder what it would mean, for example, to create a men's circle of guys in this underground internet community exploring the contradictions of our desires and drives and sexualities.
Absolutely, it would be totally different, and at the same time, sort of getting a close-up look at what the main contradictions of the 20th century men are, late and early 21st century men are, is, I think, an important way to sort of see where we don't want to go, or how we would like to avoid, or how we would like to define against, in some sense. Like, I mean, I think for me, the revolutionary acts and the small sacred moments of my day are things that help me connect to the real of my body. And the small revolutionary acts of my day are those social interactions which are decoupled from capital in some sense. So I would say, like, the sacred acts are me being in touch with my body in a non-judgmental way, in a very understanding way, in an exploring what I am type of way, decoupling from algorithms which will tell me what to like, and decoupling from algorithms which are telling me what to watch, to as much as possible become the master of the algorithms that I am interacting with, until that invisible frame has changed, hopefully, or that we exist in mediums which are no longer regulated by that invisible frame, which is a possibility, I think. And then second, giving yourself authentically, giving your attention, giving your presence. Like if you basically, here's my double move. If you treat yourself well in your aloneness, deeply treat yourself well, that you see yourself, that you recognize yourself, that you start to think of yourself as someone who really deserves time, energy, attention, and care, then you can give your time and attention to the other beyond capital with more fidelity, with more authenticity, and hopefully through the contingent networking with other such subjects, like we're doing right now, through the contingent interacting with other such subjects, we could create an other paradigm of communing, organizing, which will have to have some economic foundation, but it will be with a much more conscious political orientation, and maybe even with a result that we start to get into the meaning of politics itself. So I will just sort of like end my thought by once again reiterating this interesting quote from Sean Carroll, that we know a lot about physics, we know a little bit about chemistry, we know a little about biology, and we know nothing about politics yet. Most of our politics is unconscious. And I think for me, decoupling from the algorithms, decoupling from the political spectacle, not filling up my mind with these memes of warfare, is this emptying gesture where I could come back and have these conversations with people like you. That's the way I'm thinking about it. But I want to have a politics where my teeth are in it. I don't like this spending all my time thinking about politics, but it's a body which is I'm so impotent in relationship to it. Why am I interacting with that political body? I'm impotent in relation to that political body. I want to have a political body where my teeth are in it, where I actually have a say, where it's actually democratic somehow. And for me, I guess the last point I have is that if the people you are actually organizing your life with, if you can't talk about the real of sex, money, and power, then the power is elsewhere. The power is elsewhere, and it's just interacting with images. So I would say that. Is there any last words you would want to leave the viewers with for this notion of new politics? Because we're really in a different territory now. We're really in a different political landscape. We're not in this mode of nation-state war where we as young men are being sent off into war, obviously, like World War I, World War II. Cold War was already a abstract war of total annihilation, but now the war is directly our mind.
So one thought that comes to me, the actual root of the word political, right? It's polis, the Greek for city. And it emerges out of, it's like, what is the problem of how do we do city? And what is city? Well, 2,500 years ago, it was a few tens of thousand people, as far as I can understand it, living on in a decent sized settlement carved out of the plains by a river. What is the city today? What is the settlement? What is the place where we do our trading and our relating? Where do we meet new people? Where do we fuck people? Where do we exchange our labor for goods? How do we experience?
I think the polis today is Facebook, YouTube, all of these mega media structures where we commune virtually.
Precisely.
But we need to transcend them somehow, I think.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, we're using them.
So it's like not only has politics shifted into Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, we then need to get out of them. It's like a tube step movement. It's like the nation state is not just over. It's over, and the thing that replaced it is over.
Well, the thing that replaced it is an invisible dictatorship.
Totally.
Here's a thought. At the basis of power, this power that we've been discussing today, that has gone to the field of mind and is making itself felt through technological giants and wreaking so much havoc. At the basis of power which is always inescapable, I don't think there's any escape, it's always present, is a, let me just go back to the small creativity. Like I agree fully with both of you. Let me reinforce this point. These small creativities of shared sense making, but from the small side, from the hobbit side. Like I have a friend, he's probably watching, Pedro, with whom we sometimes start to create words that sound like something, but they're not really anything. And this, if you've had siblings growing up, or, when you're a kid, you do that, right? You start to say words that mean nothing, but they sound like something, and it's just fun, and it's play, and it's playful. And you start to imagine, oh, what might this word mean? That paranoid critical creative method, that use of juxtaposition for the engenderment of new meanings and of new things, it's there in those small things that I believe is the root, or a important root, to complement these communities that we've been discussing, to complement this bodily empowerment, because my mind is also part of my body, and the noopolitics of my own mind, or the politics of my mind, my noopolitics, my bio-noopolitics, have to do with taking a sort of creative, small, humble approach to that. In the same way that if there's 5 people or 10 people or 100 people within this tribe, and we're nomadic in the steppes, it's probably going to be like a couple of people that are a little bit more shamanic, and they could tell a story and invent new meaning for them. And then this noopolitical steppe, it is similarly chaotic, and therefore we should do a similar gesture, which is from the small side, this schizoanalytic light creation of meaning. I think it's so important, because then you have a shared vocabulary. It's the paradigm of the inner joke, or the joke, that private joke, right? And so I just wanted to reiterate that, and to complement what I fully agree that both of you have said, which is also very important.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. I think the noopolitik is this incredibly chaotic, complex landscape. I think that it's difficult to make sense of, but the ability to, I think, sense make with others who are actually in your life and are actually sort of, trying to wrestle with the same problems of daily life is maybe a start. And so for people who are out there feeling the same way, I would just reiterate that. So thank you both for joining, and